It's another Friday, Memorial Weekend coming up, and this is yet another edition of the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted. Jeremy, my son and partner, and I, as many of you know the drill, take a look at some of the issues that top the week and take a look at it from our own points of view and have, as always, a respectable and respectful conversation. As always, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing well, and you?
I'm doing well. I already know the answer since you and I talk all the time, but I just want to go on record that you're okay so that our listeners can understand that, okay?
Formality.
So I just wrote down a few things. These are possible topics, and I just wrote them down. We do have this major poll out this week. Last week we talked about the president's approval ratings and legitimacy, but the bulk of the poll we did with my brother and your uncle, Jim Zogby at the Arab American Institute, about Israel and Palestine, certainly the foreign policy issue of the week. And so I do want to talk about that a little bit and share some views. Secondly, before Congress, there are two major pieces of legislation that are up in the air. One is infrastructure, and the other is guns and background checks. And I just want to update where Congress is on that, and then what you and I may think about those pieces of legislation and what should happen and what possibly will happen. And then if we can make these kind of a semi-lightning round, the last thing I'd like to do is to talk about our colleague and my good friend, Frank Luntz, pollster extraordinaire, as I said, a good friend, and who's been in the news and been really bombarded, wouldn't you say, by critics, both critics on the right, as well as people who currently or formerly have worked for him. And no surprise, I'm going to defend Frank Luntz, even though he's a fellow that I disagree with maybe 98% of the time on issues. So how do those sound to you?
Yeah, that's fine. When we get to I might throw in a different topic, but go ahead and start off on the Middle East, especially because you've been following that since at least the '67 war, right?
Yeah, very closely. So. Yep. All right. So we see this week, or we've seen in the past few weeks, considerable differences in the coverage of the war than we've seen before. But most importantly, significant differences in the debate itself. Generally speaking, the debate over who's right and who's wrong has normally concluded that Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorists, in this case Hamas, that Israel is beleaguered and besieged by terrorists, and that Israel is a country that shares our values much more closely than Hamas and the Palestinian people do. However, for perhaps the first time in our lives, what we're seeing is a considerable rise in support for the Palestinian side on this issue, growing sympathy for Palestinians, and actually, for the first time, an issue here that can split the Democratic Party. You know, in the past, it's been, well, there's been growing sympathy for Palestinians, but be quiet, because Democratic Party gets tremendous support from American Jews and is sympathetic to the state of Israel. And this is where the Democratic Party must stand. But it is the progressives in the party, notably Bernie Sanders, now the Squad, AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and so on, that are leading on top of a grassroots movement, peace and civil justice and human rights movement that is extremely sympathetic in communities all over the United States towards the Palestinians. And we have a poll that documents that. And among the striking things is not only the growing sympathy for Palestinians, and let's make no mistake about it, there is more sympathy for Israel than there is overall for the Palestinians. But what we see overall, number one, is the growth in support for Palestinians and sympathy, growth in support for a two-state solution, and at the same time, a growing sense that the United States needs to be at least more even-handed in its approach to dealing with Palestinians vis-a-vis Israel. But what is most striking about this poll, and we're going to release the details of this poll with the podcast, so to the listeners and viewers out there, please make sure you take a look at the data. But what you will find is that the support for the Palestinians, sympathy for the Palestinians, is coming to a great degree from 18 to 44-year-olds, and that the greatest support for Israel is coming from those 45 and older, and particularly the older that you get. And so what is driving this to a great degree is what I and we together as a polling firm have been looking at now for 2.5 decades, and that is the differences in how the young and old, two major age cohorts in this country, view their world. And 18 to 44, that includes all of Gen Z, all of millennials, and then millennials are about 41 going on 42 years of age this year. It's 18 to 44 pretty much covers millennials and Gen Z. So when we ask, who are your sympathies toward, Israel or Palestine? 42% of 18 to 44-year-olds say that their sympathies are with Palestine, as opposed to 22 who say Israel. How do you view Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? 18 to 44-year-olds are split. 30% say favorable, 25% say unfavorable. But if you look at those 45 and older, 45% are favorable, 15 points higher, and only 26 are unfavorable, about the same. And should Israel's relationship with the Palestinians be referred to accurately as an occupation? 41% of the younger group say it is an occupation. 28% of those over 45 say it is an occupation. And so on down the line, we've seen this tremendous change. Before I ask for your reaction, just by way of some analysis, why are young and old seeing this differently? I've jotted down 4 reasons. Number one is people under 44 or under 40 anyway have mainly viewed this conflict since the Intifada, since the late 1980s and into the 90s and the present day. In other words, then they've seen powerful video of asymmetrical warfare between Israel and the Palestinians, as opposed to those 45 and older who would have at least had a shot of viewing Israel more from the point of view of the early legend of David Ben-Gurion and the vision of the 1967 war and of the movie Exodus. Uh, Young people don't remember the legend. They see the video today. Number two, in our poll, we asked, are you sympathetic towards the Israeli government? Not very many. Are you sympathetic toward the Palestinian government? Even fewer. But are you sympathetic towards the Israeli people? 51%. Are you sympathetic towards the Palestinian people? Almost the same, 48%. This current war has been played out as the Israeli government versus the Palestinian people. And in that sense, Israel's response has been seen as a government response against people on the ground. And hence, every time an Israeli spokesman got up and said, we have a right to defend ourselves, we're sending in more military, it was viewed as something antithetical and hurtful to people. The final point is there's a direct correlation between young people who are increasingly, as we've often discussed, non-white, and Black Lives Matter, and in this case now, the plight of other non-white peoples, the Palestinians. And so in that sense, then, we have a demographic change that is driving this change. And so, again, our poll is going to be up on the website, and please take a look at the details. What do you think, young person?
Yeah. Well, as I approach 38, I guess that's coming to an end soon, right? That I'm getting called a young person. I don't know. Maybe these days that never changes, but I agree with everything that you say. I'll put it in a much simpler form. The first thing I think about is college campuses. And to my knowledge, especially since the 60s, college campuses have long been breeding grounds of left and far left ideas. And even to when I was going in college, and in which I was very much affiliated with people like Ralph Nader and Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn. Those were, it's funny, like those were your heroes, and they were still the heroes of millennials. Of course, there were, conservative college campuses, but it seemed like more often than not, they tended to be left and far left. And so those are breeding grounds by extension for ideas that favor and pay attention to human rights abuses. And of course, if you're talking about human rights abuses, in the early 90s, probably the most popular case study or example was South Africa, apartheid. But then more and more people started to equate what was going on in the Gaza and the West Bank with South African apartheid, human rights abuses. So that was very much popular. And of course, if you were on the left or the far left, you were reading Noam Chomsky, you were reading Howard Zinn, you were reading Ralph Nader, and pretty much all three of those in one way or another, especially Chomsky, were covering those ideas. But it goes back further than that, because he's my uncle and he's your brother, but I'm being completely objective in saying this. The reality is, now Uncle Jim does not, compare or live up to Martin Luther King. But if you're going to talk about the struggle, the Arab struggle or the Palestinian struggle, the person within that world, within that community, that would be the Martin Luther King of that community is Uncle Jim. In fact, it was his strategy to take the struggle of the civil rights movement and the language and the cause and the ideas and to say, hey, look what's going on in the West Bank. My understanding is during his doctoral thesis or during one of his studies, he went over to the Middle East and witnessed it firsthand and said, oh, this is what was going on in Selma and Mobile, Alabama when I was a kid. So he connected the dots and drew a direct line to between those two struggles, and pushed and pushed and pushed the message so much that I think he was a major, if not the most major in getting that word out, that especially was welcomed on college campuses. And so, and then millennials in droves went to college, and so I think that is one of the major reasons of why we're starting to see this happen, this turning point.
I agree. And, for many, many years, the left in this country was divisible on this issue. Over on one side were all of the other human rights struggles in the world, including South Africa and including, subjugated people all over the world. But on this other side, don't touch Israel. And Israel's language and its spokesperson's language was always to not refer to the Palestinians as people, but as terrorists, as barbarians, to dehumanize, a genuine people and a genuine struggle. And there has been a substantial turn in that sensibility. And I'm going to agree with you. It is indeed my brother who stands at the forefront of building the movement within the left, being patient within the left, being very patient within the Democratic Party itself. And I think finally, as we see in this poll, and as we'll see shortly within the Democratic Party, some growing sensitivity by the party itself that this is no longer Israel-Palestine a side issue or an issue to be whispered about, but only whispered about for fear of alienating one side. This is a bona fide wedge issue between Democrats and Republicans, between young and old, and between two competing segments, an old guard and progressives, excuse me, within the Democratic Party. So enough for that issue. So I do want to talk about Frank Luntz, but I'll save it till the end. Do you want to do infrastructure and guns, or do you want to do your issue?
I personally on infrastructure, I that gets into the realm of economics. I've spoken at length over that over the month, talking about the misallocation of funds, talking about modern monetary theory, and the notion of inflation and spending your way out of a crisis, spending your way out of a recession and a depression, and effectively kicking the can down the road. I wouldn't really have much new to say. So,
well, I would, but we'll do that at another occasion because I, as always, disagree with you. But we've done that already. So take your next issue, and then we'll end with Frank Luntz.
On guns, the way I see it is, so I start off with the basis that civilization only exists because of the phenomenon of the golden rule and the silver rule. I think there's no mistake that you start to see civilizations emerging when those ideas, which came about in the axial age, this is before Christ, this is like 500 years before Christ, really start to take root. And Confucius talked about the golden rule. Jesus later on talked about the golden rule. There are variations of it. And basically, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or the negated version, do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. That's actually the silver rule, by the way. That's the rule of justice. And one of the things that I see troubling is whether it's the Second Amendment or whether it's the First Amendment or whether it's the Fourth Amendment, is it seems to be that citizens are subjected to increasing, let's say, assaults on the First, Second, and Fourth Amendments in the sense of being limited to, yet when you get to the ruling class, they're not. So let's look at gun rights. So if basically, I'm going to keep this short. If you want to limit and make it difficult for guns to get in the hands of citizens, you have to treat it like the golden rule. You have to do it across the board, because at the end of the day, federal agencies and bureaucrats and the ruling class in general are subject to the same rules. And what you see is that on the one hand, you have the militarization of the police, you have the militarization of many federal agencies who, over the last decade have bought, through government contracts, billions of rounds of ammo, have their own little police agencies, and have weapons that were literally used and being used in Afghanistan and Iraq. But now you want to talk about the citizens. So you have to do it across the board, because that is the golden rule. That's the silver rule. That's justice. So if we're going to limit and we're going to have checks against the people, it has to be across the board. You can't favor that against citizens, but not against police and federal agencies who increasingly have their own police agencies that are highly militarized. I see a very, very dangerous problem with that. The founding fathers were well aware of that. That's why they upheld the Second Amendment.
I have no problem in your argument about the need to demilitarize, at least to the degree that it is, police forces. I mean, local villages with SWAT teams and townships that have tanks, surplus weaponry from the Cold War. What are you going to do with it? Oh, you're going to make sure that police agencies, no matter how trained or untrained they are in possession of these weapons, including automatic and semi-automatic personal weapons. But where I do have a problem is, take, for example, this awful tragedy just a couple of days ago in San Jose. 57-year-old man comes in and he's targeting specific employees that he is going to murder. And in fact, he does end up murdering 9 innocent people. But they have been able to track that several years ago he was stopped at the border with all sorts of material and literature praising terrorists, outlining how terrorists operate, dangerous kinds of manifestos about the need for violence. And yet this fellow is able to purchase 32 semi-automatic weapons, magazines galore, and there is no background check whatsoever. Yet right there in his record is the background of who he was when he was detained. These are deaths that could be preventable. So before we even get into the macro arguments, do we not close loopholes at gun shows? Do we not create a system where there are fewer loopholes in who can actually purchase a weapon and who can actually sell or not sell a certain type of weapon? These are arguments that can limit the number of guns, not with any danger or threat to someone's constitutional rights, but within a framework that's already been agreed upon and established, that there are certain people who should not be able to buy guns, except if they're on the road or they do a private sale or there is an unlicensed gun show. They still have access to these kinds of weaponry. That's the sort of thing I just don't understand.
Well, I mean, this is where language is key. And
Yeah.
this is where people focus more on language than they do on policy. And this will be a good segue into Frank Luntz, because he was the master of that. He was master at, you hired him to control, or to come up with the language to control the message, to push the agenda or to push the policy. But if all of that were true, of course, look, there are these horrific cases of gun shootings, but yet it seems to me that the national media focuses more on those than they do on what goes on every weekend in Chicago, where you have dozens of deaths every weekend, and that's not considered a terrorist attack. Chicago is probably the city with the most strict gun control laws. And what does that do? Weekend after weekend, you have more than dozens of people dying. I don't know, maybe sometimes it's hit close to triple digits.
Mm-hmm.
Unless I'm wrong. I mean, maybe it's been like 50. Regardless, that's ridiculous. I mean, that's awful. So why is it that the national media focuses on, on a mass shooting? I'm not saying they don't focus on Chicago, but connect the dots. If gun control laws were that successful, they probably would have worked years ago in Chicago. But yet, it will never stop thugs. It will never stop criminals from finding a way to get it on the black market. I don't know what the answer is. It just seems to be it doesn't work.
Okay, I mean, we can leave it at that. Those are two distinct issues, but one does not negate the other.
Well, it's an analogy and it's connected.
This could have been preventable. And if we take these things 1, 5, or 9 lives at a time, we could be talking about having saved lives, at least in this and other instances where someone who should not have had a weapon was able to buy a weapon. Let's talk about Frank.
Okay. I mean, I
go ahead. Take the last word.
No, I would just be repeating. I'm just saying that you're talking about prevention, and we have a case study. And how did it stop the deaths, preventing deaths in Chicago? Chicago is an excellent case study. Look at it. But anyway, Frank Luntz.
Yeah. So let me begin by saying that again, I am an unabashed progressive, and Frank is an unabashed conservative. There are few things that we agree on ideologically or policy-wise. One thing that we do agree on is that he is an excellent opinion researcher, probably the best in the business, and he has been criticized over the years for 2 reasons. One is that there are times when he bypasses the traditional academic methodology of random probability sampling, blah, 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 and all that sort of stuff, and uses focus groups and dial tests and those sorts of things. And that secondly, he's not a member of the club, the academician club among pollsters. He's a practitioner. Stated another way, the battle is between pure science, where opinion researchers say we collect data, versus successful artistry, where someone like Frank would say, I talk to people, and real people, and probe their feelings, tweak their sentiments, find out what moves them and doesn't move them. Who is the real opinion researcher? I think it's Frank. And there is, I'm going to say it, an enormous amount of jealousy among pollsters. Too much jealousy. And I think Frank, there are pot shots being taken in him as an employer. He exacting and very strict standards, and the fact that he lives in a very posh kind of home. In fact, has a couple or maybe 3 homes, all pointing to the fact that he's been extremely successful. And I think he has been severely, unfairly criticized, both externally and internally. And my hat's off to you, Frank. I still don't agree with you on much of anything, but I think you're great at what you do.
No question about it. He's great at what he does. And I don't know what to think. I just know that it seems to be that these allegations are coming from his own employees. Mm-hmm. So not to say that that couldn't be jealousy. It's not to say that employees couldn't be saying, oh, I wish I had 3 homes. I don't know. I really don't. And although I grew up with polling and effectively I've been out in the field since I was 10 years old, you've been doing this for 40 years. You have been officially a pollster for 40 years. So I don't feel that I'm in a position to judge Frank Luntz, but to be quite frank with you, this is very frustrating because to me, this is more like back page of the news. Mm-hmm. What really troubles me is the fact that in the last couple of weeks, we have these bombshell stories that I know are being covered. I even see them on Yahoo, and I know I to an extent you see them in the national media, but really should be front and center. And these are the two faces that have really emerged. I mean, the public has always been aware of them, but really emerged in COVID since COVID-19, but are under major scrutiny. And that is, of course, Bill Gates, which started with the divorce between he and Melinda. And then shortly after that, the news, Jeffrey Epstein keeps coming back up, even though he's, in the grave, he keeps, the ghost of Jeffrey Epstein is not going to go away. And Bill Gates, of course, had a close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, a registered sex offender. We don't need to go into that. It's all right there. It's fact. It's not conspiracy theory. But that's on that one side. But on the other side is Anthony Fauci. And he's been under scrutiny for what they call gain of function research, which is essentially taking bits and pieces of different viruses in laboratory research and fusing it into what you would call a chimeric virus, a lab-grown virus. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but the fact of the matter is there is documentation on it. Wall Street Journal covered it. Of course, Rand Paul, made news by really criticizing Fauci, which is his job, which should happen. Whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican senator, you should be, putting public officials in the hot seat because public officials need accountability. And my fear is that over the years, more and more and more high-level bureaucrats have less accountability. And so when I see the national media paying more attention to, Frank Luntz and what his employees say that he's a jerk and he games he rigs the research, it's like, come on, these are the two biggest stories potentially of the year, Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci. I'm very troubled by the fact that that's not front and center page on every major newspaper.
Well, I think the Bill Gates story has been front page and continues to be. The Dr. Fauci, I don't know that has gotten as much coverage, but probably just breaking. But we covered a lot of ground today, and more to come next week. As always, send your comments to us. Share what you've seen. Help us grow this little podcast of ours. And I am going to respectably and respectfully sign off. Have a good week, Jer.
Same here. Enjoy the holiday weekend. I hope you have a great weekend.
I will. I'm going to with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take care.
You too.